Hello and welcome to Inside the Avatar Studio. Inside the Avatar Studio brings together innovative leaders from the virtual technology frontier to discuss their perceptions, perspectives, and predictions of what being virtual means in today's society. I'm your host, Kevin Feenan, and with me today is Ian Hughes, a Metaverse Evangelist and founder of Feeding Edge Ltd. In 2006, while at IBM, Ian led thousands of colleagues into virtual worlds like Second Life with projects like Wimbledon. He has shown that leadership can be driven by the native, and innovators can gather together regardless of geography or organization. Ian currently presents an emerging technology slot on the IVT Kids show, The Cool Stuff Collective, currently into its second series and about to enter into its third coming this September, and is chair of the BCS Animation and Games Industry Group. Ian will be this year's moderator for the MetaMeets conference in Amsterdam, coming up just in a couple of days. Ian, thank you, and thank you very much for coming onto the program.
Thank you very much. That was almost like I wrote that intro.
Almost. Now all I have to do is get used to reading stuff here, and I'll be doing really, really good. I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of context in terms of some of the projects that you've been involved with over the last year or two.
Yeah, certainly. Lots of the things that I do seem to be about interacting between multiple environments and about crossing boundaries between environments. So one particular one, which I've talked about a bit about before, but I can talk more about now because it's been more public, was one that uses both Second Life and OpenSim. So we've got a choice of pretty much the same environment, but Second Life and OpenSim, to help build an environment to evaluate doctors in. So in that environment, there's a virtual patient in a hospital environment. So there's a set of objects that have been built, and Shukra and Serendipity builds all those, and he's a very talented builder because some of the oldest things in Second Life are built by him. I think you eventually discover when you're working with him. But in that environment, there are things that have to happen with that patient. There are responses that the patient has to have. They have to bleed out, or there has to be a change in the machinery or something. And so my bit of work was a broker that sits, a script basically, that sits under the covers, literally under the covers of the bed, and it does the things of telling this model what to do in this environment, but it gets its information about what to do, and it passes on results of what's happened to a big proper model, if you like, a data model of the virtual patient and the scenario that's held completely outside the system. So that's been modeled by another third party. So there's a model of a patient, a model of the state of the patient, a model of the scenario that the clinical practitioners want to run, has been created with almost without any awareness that it's got anything to do with the virtual environment. And the aim was to create this model so you could step through and say, well, if this happens with a patient, what would you do? Set of responses, test reactions, test you kind of take the right clinical path, so that they could run side-by-side evaluations of a clinical practitioner doing that on a web page, step, or doing it in a virtual environment where they had this extra level of immersion. And so that lots of those things, particularly with Imperial College, have been about them doing the research to see whether this stuff works. We all know it works because that's why we're all sat here, but it's scientifically it's good for them to test that. And so they've been putting hundreds of tens, probably hundreds of doctors through that at various levels to see what impact it has on them. And so that's all about not building it all in one place, because not every environment is ideally suited to doing every single thing you'd ever want. And, Second Life is lovely, it's great, it's social, we can talk, we can build things, we can move stuff around, but that's not the best place to keep the model of a patient's body and know about the physiology of them. That's best held somewhere else. So
it's kind of interesting that you bring up that particular example, because I mean one of the things that we've seen with Inside Second Life, and in fact, with Rockcliffe, we've actually worked on a couple of similar type projects ourselves, and it sounds like a lot of people are actually going about this in a very similar way in terms of how they're approaching it. That there's this concept of disconnectedness between what it is you're really trying to do with the virtual environment and the actual virtual environment itself.
Yeah, well, I think it's using the elements of a particular virtual environment to do what it's good at doing. So, it is particularly good at if you're dealing with a patient and you see that they're changing colour and the machines are beeping and that all hell's breaking loose because you've done something, and you're then stood there in a position saying you need to do it, but it's not the environment to make the decision about whether that thing should happen to that patient. Mm-hmm. So it's no different to what we normally do in computer systems. We had model view controllers, so you have something to see and operate with, and you have something that's about the data, and you have something shuffling the stuff backwards and forwards, kind of brokering those things, and that's kind of always been what people have been trying to do with the web, really, for a long while as well. So for ages, kind of web services was the kind of technical hook into things, and web services were there. They were the next step of the web, and they were going to change the world and what we were going to do. And the kind of protocol for web services sort of died because it was all too complicated to describe what you needed to do. But we've ended up with lots of systems all talking to one another, sometimes through really simple ways, just doing quick RSS feeds or a little HTTP request without the huge formality, so that every system can be flexible enough to talk to every other one. So one of the other things we dropped into the Imperial stuff was Second Life's not particularly good at doing text, and to ask you to make a decision on something based on a load of text, like a web page. But now we've got shared media, we thought, well, why don't we put up a web page that's got all this extra information you need that you can use as the menu whenever you need to fall back from the virtual environment and just go to a text menu, say, which one of these things do you want to do? So we started presenting menus not as in-world objects, which is what we started doing, but as on a prim, as a piece of web information. But that technically is a fourth system now, because the website isn't anything to do. Second Life doesn't know it's talking to a website or what the website's doing. It just knows there's a URL to show. So we were trying to explore how far you could push that interaction. So now you go to a web page, press a button to start a scenario or select the scenario you want to do. That triggers the broker in world, because it's got using HTTP in, it's firing some stuff in. That then starts pulling information from the data server, from the kind of big important boss of data, and then starts firing messages off into Second Life so that things happen to the patient. And it's nicely over-engineered, but it was a good way of testing testing whether that made sense, because it's much easier to build a web page menu and using just a bit of PHP or Drupal or something to do stuff than it is to start trying to get text lined up and buttons and things in this environment, because Second Life is really rubbish at it.
Yeah. I mean, have you found that there were very specific limitations with Inside? And I realize we're sort of getting into a very specific virtual world here, but were there some very specific hurdles that you were trying to overcome in here that just were sort of insurmountable, or things that you had to find really, really interesting workarounds for? Or?
I think that the trying to maintain state across things where you've got websites that want to be stateless, really, and then you've got any virtual environment be the same, is trying to give you the same shared experience. Those kind of things about, I said about model view controller, which bit's in charge, and where's the final arbiter of what's supposed to be going on. So there's lots of particularly in this environment, if you do something and then you have to wait for all these things downstream to come back, you can't block, you can't sit there and stop Second Life while you wait all that to happen. So they might click on something else. So you end up with this, if a doctor panics and starts clicking on everything all at once, what on earth is that going to do? And what order are you going to process them in? Are you going to make sure you process those things in order? That flow control was not something that that the virtual environment wants to do. It just wants to just do stuff as and when it happens. So threading things was difficult. It was difficult in an operating system anyway, but it's more difficult in here.
Right. Now, have you tried doing this with other virtual worlds beyond like OpenSim Second Life, or because I know you've got a couple of things on your blog with regards to I think Cyber or Seer Engine I think was the one, and
there's I've
Unity
always
3D is another.
Yeah, well, Unity. I use Unity quite a lot in some of the other projects we do. So we're not building virtual world stuff so much, but building kind of mini games and things that that can be multi-user things, but they're not the fully creative, fully immersive virtual environment, because that takes quite a lot to build. And so looking at things like Unity to present a much richer, easier for a graphic designer, a 3D graphic designer, to build virtual environment in a more traditional kind of game sense, and then working out how much of that you can get away with as being actually pretty fixed, that it doesn't have to be streaming like all the Second Life stuff, trying to figure out actually if we put everything in there we get all the atmosphere we need, and we only actually need to turn 2 or 3 lights on every now and then in the environment to keep them in sync, and it'll have an impact. And so you go, well, do you want the richness of being able to render fantastic visuals versus have to deal with the whole server side of things, which Unity doesn't have, so you have to talk to something else? Or do you take the kind of roughness of Second Life and OpenSim and do it that way? But it certainly it kind of moves you into game development territory when you're trying to have multiple clients in Unity try and stay in sync. Mm-hmm. It may look all the same, but there's a lot that goes on in games, particularly that is there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. If you play Modern Warfare on your Xbox, the client, as we were saying earlier, the client is huge. It's sat there, big installed thing. If there's a bullet goes flying past, it's not telling 32 people exactly where that bullet is every kind of tiny little bit of a second. It's just saying, oh well, it's hit something over there, let's have a particle puff of smoke. Yet that gives enough immersion. So all it has to do is say where the people are and with what their health is. So there's only 32 things that it's managing. and yet when you go into something like Second Life, it's managing everything all the time. So you can kind of do the Modern Warfare thing in Unity really easy, but you can't do the experience you have in Second Life of just being able to build stuff quite so simply.
Yeah, it's sort of what I tell people when we conduct building classes here is that a lot of what we do in terms of the virtual environment is all about the creation of magic, right? We're not, to a certain extent, we're not really building the thing that it is we think we're building. What we're doing is we're building enough of a representation to fool the senses into believing that what we're sitting in is a chair, or what we're doing is battling zombies or whatever else.
And that's with some of my clients, I've been using the term atmosphere quite a lot, and saying, because when you look at these things at face value, people naturally move into, particularly when doing mirror world stuff, they naturally say, well, actually, we want to recreate the physical world with all its all its attributes and all its foibles and all its stuff. And it's like, well, do you, or do you actually want this one situation to look like it's really bad? Lots of fire and smoke and stuff like that. Are you bothered about being able to open doors on a block of flats you're never going to go near. You're not. So it's about the atmosphere and about trying to tell the story. And so that balance of then trying to get things like narrative into these, even if it's a training simulation or a doctor thing or a disaster or something, trying to get people to consider narrative rather than pure visuals, and why you're going to do that. And there are choices we can make, and we can do this quite quickly and simply with no scripting, no anything, just use the environment, put all the stuff in there. Somebody stands in it, they will feel something. Is that enough? Is it enough for them to go, I feel I've actually been there? Or, you know, one of the examples I use, I always talk about the kind of oil rig things. And if you need to know where an emergency exit on an oil rig is, you can be shown a nice blueprint. You can be shown some photos. You can actually go on an oil rig, or you could wander around a model that's taken like an hour to build that says roughly the emergency exit's kind of past that barrier and around the corner, and you walk it, and that's enough for your brain. You don't need to build a fully working oil rig that's trying to drill down into the surface of Second Life or whichever platform and bring oil up. It's not for that. It's a pattern. It's a maquette that you just have to wander around enough to get that experience. So yeah.
Very cool. I'm wondering about how much, because I mean a lot of, and we've had conversations on here with regards to copyright and all this other type of stuff in terms of intellectual property and who owns what. But the reality of virtual worlds is that almost everything is a derivative work of something that somebody else has done within here. How much do you find that you end up borrowing from other, I guess, sort of other games and other media that are out there? So, for example, I mean, City of Heroes and World of Warcraft have a very specific way that they go about introducing narrative into the role of gameplay, and to a certain extent, they do it fairly well. Based on comparison with other games, right? But then you take a look at these things and you think, okay, do we replicate this or do we try to do something different?
Well, I think when you're in it depends which bits we end up talking about there. But when we're talking about kind of these training simulation things that are there to evaluate real world skills in a real world environment, the discussion about narrative is in order to get somebody to stop worrying about what colour the bedsheet is, whether it's off-white or slightly off-white. So, well, is that important to the story, if you like? So it becomes less about character development or any of those things. But when you're then dealing with trying to develop a game, a proper game environment, and try to get people enthralled and engaged and excited, then you end up having to draw on the experiences of what the trends are and what people expect from a game, and so people don't expect Space Invaders anymore, where they're not told why they're shooting something down. It's a lovely game. I love Space Invaders, but there's usually can we have a bit of backstory to it? and I know Space Invaders kind of had it on the side of the cabinet, but it wasn't really, and so the game storytelling thing is advancing all the time, and new kind of lexicons are appearing, aren't they? New things that you sort of expect that help you guide your way through what might be, particularly in the sandbox environments. If it's a huge sandbox environment, it's like, what do I do now? There are things that are common across some of the games that have just kind of come into being. I don't think anyone particularly designed them. It's just a couple of people thought they'd try it, and then somebody else said, oh, I've seen that sort of works, that made me feel happy. But there's always more to do. There's always somewhere to take this. That's the exciting piece about it, because there are people that are doing things in these environments that aren't professional game developers, that aren't stuck in their ways and copying all the other games and trying to chase the latest and greatest, which is why you get beautiful things like Minecraft turn up, which is creative and interesting and weird and kind of got a bit of a Second Life vibe going with it, and come out of nowhere just because somebody said, well, I'm not going to copy all those things, I'm going to do what I want to do.
You mentioned about pro game developers, and I know from a number of the products that I've sort of been seeing come out of late. I mean, Second Life was kind of interesting, or is kind of interesting. Let me restate that. From the standpoint of, there's some very complex game development that can be done in here, although this isn't really a proper game development engine. But I mean, it made it accessible to a large number of people, which was I think was the really innovative thing, and the big thing that really put Second Life on the map was, here was something where anybody could come in. My grandmother could come in, and she could develop a virtual world in here. I mean, it was accessible with a little bit of work. And now we're seeing more and more as we go along that some of the extension of what we're doing here requires how do I know she's requires more of that pro game developer type of person in order to start taking this stuff up to the next level. Do you think we're starting to lose something in where all of this stuff is sort of going?
I do think that there's a risk to that, because as we, particularly if you take the Second Life example, because it's a good one to stick with since that's where we're sat at the moment, the ability for a talented designer to, if we just take the visuals, forget the code, but a talented designer using the restrictions of Second Life can make some things that are better than most of us can make, and certainly that I can make, because I'm not a designer, so I just kind of bung a few boxes together. But I can feel that the things that I make, and printers that I twist, and textures that I slap on, and weird things that I do, still feel part of the environment. As you kind of ramp that tooling up, and you ramp up the how much it can do and how much it can render, and we talk about mesh and all that sort of stuff, when you start getting to the quality of where high-end games are and where they'll continue to go, if you start doing funny little doodles in Second Life, they look just like a pile of graffiti. So an environment itself can get too, if it's going to be a dynamic creative environment, can get too beautiful and too pristine that it alienates people that are not those professional developers. And in some respects, that same thing happens with the code under the covers, because the richness of what you can do becomes greater and greater, so people don't bother trying to code anything ever again. But it's equally, we want to be able to have both. You want to be able to, and as we do in real life, we have beautiful paintings, and we have people doing sketches on the back of cigarette packets, and they are for a different purpose. And what happens in here, though, is these environments, everyone's constantly looking for that one environment that smashes everything together, and that's where you end up with a bit of tension, I think, isn't it? And as you said, Second Life isn't a high-end game engine. It's doing a lot of high-end game. It's doing some really interesting stuff with how the world can just change around you, which doesn't happen in a game. But because it's doing that, it can't cope with, and it'd take a lot for it to be able to cope with the kind of beautiful nature of what we've got used to in games. And but equally, the development costs of high-end games to meet those production values that people are starting to expect are kind of going a bit mad now, and have been for quite a long while, and so the sales in games are going down because there's only a few mega titles that people will get, which has then opened up this creative flow of things like Minecraft, like I said, and kind of the app developers and iPhone and stuff, which are funny little quirky backroom games that suddenly, because we've got a distribution network that can reach everyone in the world instantly, become hugely popular. So whilst we've got high-end stuff, we've got low-end stuff that's being more successful. So, and I think you'll always have that that cycle.
So it's interesting, the low end stuff, because I mean we've had conversations here as part of this this series in terms of the role of mobile and the role of where mobile and virtual may potentially intersect as we go along down the line. But yet, you mentioned something interesting here is in terms of we get a lot of very silly type applications for mobile, which gain success simply because they've got a really good distribution network. I'm wondering to a certain extent. I mean, there's obviously something fueling this other than just the ability to make a buck off of off of an app.
Yeah.
An app, right? I mean, there seems to be this desire out there for people to want to express their creativity with inside a virtual sense. And I know you've been to an awful lot of conferences as part of the work that you do. I mean, are you seeing more and more of this as we go along? I mean, not just inside the mobile world, but sort of like across the board type of thing?
Well, I think the fact that it's taking a little while to dawn on people that that they don't have to be spoon-fed everything. And for this is kind of the trend of what was going on with the web, wasn't it? The kind of the web arrived and everyone was used to newspapers and news sites and stuff, and used to product catalogs and stuff. So they just sat and took it all and sat and listened to it all and sat and watched all the things that were being made for them, and assumed that they weren't worthy to go out and do anything or touch it or adjust it. And building a website was a high art form that only us techies could dare go near a server and all that kind of stuff. But the very nature of the web and what it was there for in the first place was to spread the exchange of information and to just work on things with one another. And so as people have absorbed that idea, and they take little baby steps of going, oh, I'll just organise something on Facebook first or something, whatever it is, or I'll just tweet something and we'll have a meeting, have a little tweet up. That starts to open up their minds and to the power of being able to self-organise around projects and do creative things in whatever field they want to do, whether they want to make a buck or whether they want to change the world. That those things are available for them to do because we've got such a fantastic way of communicating with people. And whatever your medium of choice is, within bounds of what the digital does at the moment, you can get on and use that. So if all you want to do is a little app, you can do it, and you can put it on the App Store. It might not be successful or whatever. If you want to do a fantastic movie, you can stick it online and do YouTube stuff, and that's fantastic. If you want to write documents and you want to write stories, you're kind of in wiki territory. If you want to sit and build interactive environments with one another, you've got places like Second Life to do it. And so those things are releasing that creativity and letting people self-organize and gather around things. And that's where, as people, we start to sometimes then get too comfortable with one particular platform to kind of replace. It's almost like replacing the spoon-fed thing that we had, that we say, oh, well, we're here now, we're going to stay in this one, and we're not going to do anything else. Or you get but you do get the chance to say, well, actually, we'll do a little bit in here and a little bit over there, and this bit's relevant over here, and let's pull it all together and make it about us, not about the technology. And that's what I think is happening. But there is that undercurrent of people saying, well, I can make a fast buck at the moment doing a rubbish little app on the iPhone. and that's unfortunate, but that's life, isn't it? That's what people.
Well, I mean,
I buy them.
Yeah, I mean, they come and go. This is probably how we got Space Invaders in the first place. You seem to point to this idea that communications has really been the driver behind this, but to a certain extent, I'm also wondering whether or not the fact that we have especially in first world countries, we have a more educated and a more aware population in terms of people taking responsibility for their own education, and not just a matter of being able to communicate with others, but the fact that the educational content is there, and then also to a certain extent, like environments like Second Life provide, an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, is it more complicated than what we're looking at, or is what we're going through right now really a natural consequence of social networking, the way it's developed?
I think you're right about the kind of education level of what you might, and the willingness, or the apparent willingness, to take responsibility and think that we're happy to take responsibility. But if you go into any corporate office and sit there, you'll see lots of people sitting there in a feudal system waiting for their lord and master to tell them what to do. They're not kind of freewheeling people going off. There is a lot of entrepreneurship, but there's an awful lot of, please tell us what to do now, because we're educated, so that's what we're educated to do. So we don't know any better. And so some people are breaking that kind of from the first world. But if you take the social networking that's going on, and the stuff that's going on in the Middle East, and the way that people are talking to one another, you wouldn't have expected that to happen. But they've just made the instant leap. It wasn't a slow thing. It was like suddenly you had a mobile and it was connected to everything. They didn't have to go through having a kind of a big dumb terminal, then a desktop computer, and then maybe get a laptop, and then maybe get a mobile phone that possibly did WAP but didn't really, so it never worked. So you kind of did the SMS message maybe, or maybe you had a pager or stuff like that. And they just went straight to, here's a globally connected piece of technology in my hand that's achievable. That's not everywhere in the world, but there are. And like in India, for instance, the mobile is massive. They don't all have laptops. And so then when they have the willingness to communicate and they have a reason to communicate, they self-organize and gather, and the world alters. And that's the fascinating bit, that it is that leap of, once you know you can talk to somebody, once you accept that there's a channel there to talk, and you free yourself from the worry about whether you're allowed to talk to them or not, or a repressive regime says you can't talk to them and you say, sod that, I'm going to anyway, then that's when the changes happen. And in corporate stuff, there's the whole thing of, for years, I mean, for ages, it was like, well, you can't go and talk to that person in that department unless your manager introduces you. And it was like, that's ridiculous. So now everyone's talking to one another and getting stuff done.
Well, hopefully they're talking to one another. It depends on the industry. Well, I mean, if everybody tries to do it by email, and then nothing gets done.
Exactly. And email is another one. It's kind of not exactly pushing the boundaries of human communication, is it?
Well, it opened up a lot of doors, but at the same time, I mean, one of the things that I find, and it's sort of, this whole idea of freedom of action, right? That I think is what it is that you're really getting at here. I mean, certain things, you take a look at email, where it's opened up a whole pile of freedom of action in terms of people being able to communicate with one another, but then at the same time, people use email as a crutch sometimes to not talk to one another, and something that could be very easily resolved by just picking up a telephone. Right?
Absolutely. And
10 seconds of your time by telephone, right, or Skype or whatever, right?
Yeah, well, that's where we had. I mean, it was unusual to watch the spread of instant messaging when I was in IBM, because this is years ago when some people kind of knocked up a instant messaging system, and a few of us, being early adopters, said, "Oh, that's good. That saves opening this stupid email client, doesn't it?" And so you found us kind of pinging one another quickly as we do now, just pinging one another quickly to get an answer. And once you've done it once and you've got the right response, it is this switch that's flicked. That why would you want to do anything else? But lots of people around it were going, "Oh, I don't understand it. Why would I ever want to do that?" And it's that kind of stepping back and being scared of it, which is what people do with the virtual worlds. They say, well, I don't want to go there. That looks scary, when it's not. or I don't want to, I don't want to engage with X, Y, Z technology because it's scary. And so trying to help people just say, look, don't worry about the technology. That's not what you're really scared about. It's the people and the way it may change your life that's probably scaring you. But it might change your life for the better if you just go and have a go with it.
I wanted to ask you something else about this idea of freedom of action, and to a certain extent the people being scared of changing technologies. There's been this, and for lack of a better word, I'll use this. There's been this conceit upon first world nations that has basically said, we control the development path and we are going to show the rest of the world what it is that they need to do. And in fact, that really hasn't been the case, because as we've seen, especially with telecommunications, where an infrastructure has not developed through the slow plodding route of the multinational corporations, you go into some place like India or you go into some place like China, and they don't pick up with landlines. They jump technologies. They go to whatever the most current, and they start building from there. You've seen a lot of gadgets, and you've seen a lot of different things in terms of where some of this technology is going. Are there aspects of this leaping forward that we can look to places like India and other places and say, well, they're doing these really neat and interesting things with the technology, which are sort of a jump or two ahead of where the rest of us are right now, and we really need to start taking some of those lessons back and applying them to what we're doing here in the first world?
Yes, I mean, I think the problem lies with this shock of the new, and that people have a lot of possibly time, or they have something invested. They might have said, I think this is a good idea once, and then they can't possibly back down and say, actually, there's a better idea. And so somebody else doing something better is what happens, whether it's countries or companies or the person next door or any of those things. That seems to be what the human race is kind of stuck doing. And that's where the disruptive innovation comes from. And it's sitting there and it's obvious. And you look at it, or some of us look at it and you go, well, that's obvious, you should do it that way, shouldn't you? And then this bubble of no, mustn't come out of the cave. And eventually the disruptive innovation becomes so big that it sweeps over the cave anyway, and they're all on board and everyone's happy and off they get on with it. And where they're technologies that's, because it's not necessarily about sweeping anything away. It's about augmenting what's already there or improving what's already there. If it's positive and go in the right direction, the fact that a few people want to sit and wait, I'm kind of comfortable with that, because that's their fault. So trying to encourage people to look at new things and to think new thoughts, you're going to get like 10% of people going, oh, I can think new thoughts, let's get on with it. And that's enough to push it. And if you try and get everyone, that's kind of as an evangelist, I know I can't take everyone with me in virtual worlds. If I'm talking to a room, there'll be at least one person in the room who's going to not get it. They're just going to stick their heels in. But if you change one person's mind, that's enough, because they'll do something with it.
Right. When you're talking about this in terms of the ability to communicate ideas and what have you, you were talking in one of your blogs earlier this month about this idea of scaling, and that having more doesn't always add to the experience.
Yes.
Right. Sorry, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit, because I mean we've sort of, or it appears that we have run into this victim of our own success mentality with regards to scaling. I mean, you've got Facebook, and you're not considered successful unless you've got 100,000 hits on your fan page. Yeah. But yet, here it is, we're inside a virtual environment, and as you had mentioned, 50 is an awful lot of people. Yeah. For a social network, depending upon the quality of what it is you're looking to do.
Yeah, and that's where you kind of get the part of what I was writing there was it was thinking about what game developers were going to say about OpenSim when I try and tell them about OpenSim, the kind of more hardcore AAA game developer hearing that there's this quirky bit of open source that you can do this stuff that kind of looks a bit odd, doesn't it? But you can talk to everyone and do everything, and equally the stuff that the resistance in business circles to virtual environments by going, oh well, no, I can't talk to 72 trillion people, and that's back to this expectation that everything's about broadcasting. And it doesn't have to be. Sometimes you do. So when you're talking about the traditional advertising model is you need lots of people to see your advert, otherwise that's not working. So you're not making money or whatever it is you're trying to do. But that's their success criteria. For me, its success criteria is having a good conversation with somebody, and the idea is interchange with that. And I can't do that with 100,000 people at the same time. Yet, if we're trying to crowdsource a project where we need lots of code built and we've defined it and need what to do, then we need to kind of muster the forces of 50 or 100 or 1,000 people to kind of all understand one another enough and be able to move forward with whatever it is they're building. And so then that doesn't mean you need an auditorium with 100,000 people in it in a virtual environment, but you need something to help kind of broker that human understanding and something more than just a documentation of a project or something more than just a running piece of code. It's that it being able to understand one another. There's doing a concert and sharing your tunes to a huge audience and to a massive stadium, which is obviously what the record industries want to do. But then there's this more intimate thing of being able to sit and communicate and share and say, look at this, this is what I think, and somebody saying, well, actually, this is what I think, and how you manage to broker that human conversation at distance. That's a completely different thing from having a concert that 100,000 people can listen at, which is why there's not one all singing, all dancing platform, but why Second Life is actually quite good. As I said, it does more. If you get 50 to 100 people in a sim, that's a lot more people all in one place doing the same thing than you get in any of the games, with the exception of Eve. High-end games are 16 people, 32 people, generally maximum. And Warcraft does it, it's kind of sharded, so it's a bit cheating. And here, you can organise an event with 50 plus people in a small enough space that you can all see one another and hear one another. I'm not sure that answered the question. That was, but I kind of expanded on what because there's not one. The thing was there isn't one answer, and whichever one you put in front of somebody, if they're going to object, they'll object with the other one. So a business will say, well, I can't have 100,000 people. Whereas, well, you only need 2. You just need them to be talking to one another rather than getting on a plane. And I go, oh, yeah, that's not what we want.
Well, to a certain extent, I guess it's a matter of filtering how our real lives work as well. I mean, you go into an airport where there may be 10,000 people coming and going through various different airplanes, but all you ever see is the 20 or 30 people around you that are waiting inside the lounge.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And trying to get your advertisement message out to everybody in the airport is substantially different from having a conversation with the people in the waiting room.
And that's there back to whether you're talking atmosphere or kind of a targeted narrative for something, isn't it? So that's there are things where feeling the buzz of a huge crowd at a concert is different to anything we do online. Feeling the buzz of the crowd at a motor racing and that's or a football match, they are that kind of tribal huge gathering of people. You're only experiencing the people right next to you, but there is something that we don't do yet in getting that atmosphere across.
Well, is some of that atmosphere, however, and I realize I'm talking to somebody from the UK, which considering what soccer matches are like out there, or football matches. My apologies. The it's some of the atmosphere of a crowd, not just simply noise, that can be replicated to a certain extent. I mean, obviously, you get a large football crowd, and they start getting into a group chant. Yeah. That is a mob dynamic that is very difficult to mimic in terms of background noise. But you go to a baseball game or a football game or whatever, where you don't have that type of dynamic that's going on, and can it not just simply be simulated that way?
You can simulate audio. There are, and that's the trick of the cinema, isn't it? If you like, and television and stuff, to give you enough, and games do it too. Give you enough triggers that you kind of make fill in the blanks yourself, and that's not wrong. But I think we've got an opportunity with these environments to be able to, and with all the technologies emerging around it, a lot of us know that we have very strong bonds with people and come to an understanding with people in things like Second Life, don't we? The conversation, the way you work, where you sit, who you stand near, where you go, where you hang out, all those things are things that help reinforce the bonds and let us know who we are. But if you just took it at that instant face value moment, which is what people that don't get this stuff will say, they say, well, it's not as good as being there. And what I want this to be better than being there. And I don't know what we need to invent for it, but you can kind of see that if you take a use case like a crowd isn't just the noise, because it is the feeling and the panic that and the kind of feeling of protection of being surrounded by those people, and the feeling of worry that it might all kick off, and that's there's a whole lot of other things going on other than just the audio and just the visuals of that, and to be able to feel that emotion, and to be able to share those emotions with people, and to be able to manage those emotions and be able to engineer those emotions is some things that we can do with these platforms, because we're sitting here at the moment, we're pinging voice backwards and forwards, and we've kind of got a bit of gesture because we're sat next door to one another, but there's more about being human that we can transfer backwards and forwards. I think there's a lot more, not just gestures, but just actually how you're feeling. Right. And for me to give you the cues of how I'm feeling, and in a way that connects us even tighter.
I do have two other topics that I want to bring up, one of which ties into what we're talking about right at the moment, but I do need to get them in before the hour sort of up. Okay. The one is, I want to talk about some of the work that you've been doing with the IEEE, and to a certain extent, I mean, we're talking about items here that sort of indirectly impact on the virtual worlds standards working group. Yeah. Which I know you've been involved with. Can you give us a little bit of an idea in terms of what's happening there, and what some of the implications of the work that they're trying to do is going to have on virtual worlds as we move forward? Okay.
Well, the IEEE piece is something that's sparked out of mainly of Sandy Kearney, who left IBM as well and formed E426.org, and she's been very passionate and thought leader in these environments for ages, and she was kind of saying wanted us, with all of us, to kind of start gathering together again, because we'd all kind of, everyone seems to have disappeared off, and that we've had the 2006-7 bubble and all that stuff, but we're now getting to a point where there's lots of environments, there's lots of stuff going on, and she got the IEEE more interested, because they were looking at virtual environments anyway, but more interested in trying to look at everything about what this means, that both the virtual environments and AR, not just about data interchange and can we move a mesh from A to B, because we know we can do that, really. It was about the more creative layers of interaction between environments, and the best use cases and the best exemplars of how you do certain things. So like I was talking about the medical thing, Imperial doing the research, that they've got results there about what works. And so that's the sort of thing that a good standards body like IEEE kind of foster and like to keep, because they like to have that consensus between people about what's a good way of doing things. So this is kind of spinning out into a thing that's happening in September, or initially this one's happening in September, which is a summit for this this kind of virtual collab piece, I think we're calling it now, and it's about getting a load of people together in a very unusual environment, because it's going to be kind of Hollywood somewhere, and those people in about 100 people or so, kind of in various groups and teams, being set a load of major challenges to look at across virtual worlds and virtual environments, from things like how do we reach one another emotionally, to how do we move data from A to B, because that'll be there as well. And so that it's an attempt to start the ball rolling again, really, on all the things that we're all individually going off and doing. All of us here are all doing these things, and we do come together and talk about them and stuff, but it's good to have a shepherding organisation like the IEEE kind of wanting and be interested enough to get hold of it and drive it, and not just want to do, I mean, I love technology, but not just do version numbers of Wi-Fi or something, because that's important, but this is working at a kind of higher level because of the people involved in it. So and it's kind of becoming more and more open to all, because we needed to work out what it was in the first place, but we're now kind of in that blossoming stage, and this summit is the first test of that, and it's going to be treated like there's some game elements to it in order to get people to enjoy what they're doing, but there's some kind of TV production elements and film production elements in how it's captured and what it's going to be, and it'll be interesting to see what it is. And there's also a huge virtual component to it, because not everyone's going to be going to Hollywood, because that's quite expensive.
Is there an expectation in terms of what they're going to achieve in terms of an outcome, other than just simply defining the parameters of how big this this beast is that we've got by the tail?
Well, it is to identify and it's building on the work that's already there, about understanding some of the use cases that are important, some of the gaps that are missing, that we need to go off and invent things. As I was just saying about we were all kind of piling challenges in as a big pot of challenges, so that we can kind of give people something to do and think about, and some of them were world changing, like how to what is it about some of this technology, not just one particular virtual world, but all the various technologies, can we make the world a better place with it, is one thing. Can we make teachers more effective with students, and can we those sort of elements there, as well as can we help people understand one another better and kind of stop wars. So they're kind of quite high goals for some of the challenges, but then say some of the others are what works well if you're trying to make a patient bleed out on a table to affect a response in the doctors enough that you can measure it. And so those things, the ends of this kind of 2-day challenge is some results about what works, what people have thought about. It's part idea generation, part synthesis, part putting it back together again, and those things become the stepping stone for the next level of all that goes out to the world. Say, let's build on it, which is where you have to start with a standards organisation. And so it's far more than making an object go from one virtual environment to another. It's up a few levels into the narrative and into human need.
But I think a conversation that sort of really needs to happen, especially considering what we're seeing now. I mean, there's so much in terms of things where you've got various different groups that are all trying to create standard, quote unquote standards for the industry, and invariably they are, I guess to a certain extent, self-centered in terms of where the the agendas coming from in terms of why people are saying, it's sort of like the Microsoft approach. Thou shalt do nothing other than what Microsoft tells you, right?
Well, I think that's where I hadn't hung with IEEE people that much before, but now I understand a bit more about why. You kind of see IEEE everywhere. Their skills are in brokering consensus, so they're used to this kind of piling in from multiple parties saying, well, I want to do this, 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 and sometimes one of those will win out, really, but in general it's about consensus. It's not a scientific certainty which one it is, and it's not always necessarily the best one, but it's a starting point to say, you're doing that, you're doing that, you're doing that. They're quite similar, really, aren't they?
Yeah.
Now you've thought about it, they're quite similar. Is there some stuff that will make everyone's life easier and let other things build off it?
I do need to ask you about MetaMeets, because MetaMeets is coming up in a couple of days, and I know that you're getting ready to hop on a plane, I think tomorrow morning.
Yep, well, yes, it's in a few hours. No, it's all right.
In a few hours. Oh, excellent. Okay, great.
It's after lunch, so it's only 12 hours away. That's right.
Oh, okay, well, that's not bad. Time for a nap and, bite to eat, and off you go. My understanding is that you're the master of ceremonies. You're the main moderator for the conference, which I would think is kind of exciting, because there's been a lot going on with MetaMeets in the last couple of years, and I know you did a big write-up about some of the neat things that happened last year. What are some of the things that you're expecting to see this year that you're sort of really excited about at MetaMeets?
Well, a bit that always makes me excited. Whilst all the kind of business side of things is great, and we have to talk about them, I think it's the explosion of and the meeting of lots of different ways that people have of expressing themselves, and it's running the same time as the Machinima Festival and things, and so whether it's kind of radio, or whether it's TV, or whether it's music, or whether it's art, and those things mixing at the same time with the other artists that are who express things in code. So the fact that there's a big open sim contingent there, and Justin CC is going to be there, and he's one of the core developers of it. We've all got our own instruments of choice, and they all come together into this one place, and these ideas bounce around, and it's the discussion and the conversation, not unlike we said with the IEEE stuff, but the discussion and the conversation that makes it so vibrant and exciting, and the fact that really it is like a mass evangelist conference, because we all get it, and so you don't have to do the justification about why you're doing it in the first place, because we've all come together because that's what we know what we're talking about. So you can it is leveling up. It's leveling up in understanding and picking on it. It's just hearing some points of view that if you hang around with a load of corporate people a lot, you don't hear it, for instance. Or if you hang around with a load of musician people, you may not hear the corporate point of view, and you start putting those things together, then only good things happen.
Very, very cool. Ian, I'd like to thank you very much. That's all the time we have available for the broadcast show today. I'd like to invite you to stay for an after-show wrap-up if you're still available.
I'm certainly available, yes.
Excellent. Okay. It's been wonderful having you on the show, and we definitely want to have you back, because there's so much that I did not get to ask that I would really, really like to ask and expand on in terms of some of these concepts that we've been talking about. Just as a bit of a wrap-up here, that's it for Inside the Avatar Studio from the Rockcliffe Rotunda. Inside the Avatar Studio is produced by Bevan Whitfield and Rockcliffe University Consortium. Technical production by Robustus Hacks and Mal Burns in association with Metaverse TV. For more information on Inside the Avatar Studio, please check out our website at urockcliffe.com, or check it out on Metaverse TV, or you can check our Twitter, which is also urockcliffe, or our Facebook fan page. And I'd like to thank everybody that came here to watch and to participate.